Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible in part by a grant from the Imlay Foundation.
This is a show about how a disaster seemingly far away can impact an entire region, including Georgia. It's also a show about how the economy and ecology really are closely connected. And unfortunately, it's a story that may not have an ending for quite some time.
The Gulf Coast is like the Georgia coast in many ways. People come here to play in the sand, swim in the surf, and enjoy the ocean breeze. The local economy is tied to these visitors and the money they spend on vacation. Also like Georgia, this is an area rich with wildlife. The Gulf states are lined with marshes and wetlands that give birth to many of the same birds that frequent our shores, birds that may migrate to the Georgia coast on a regular basis. Also like Georgia, fishing is a huge part of the economy. The Gulf of Mexico is known to many as the oyster capital of the world, and a major portion of the fish and shrimp harvested domestically comes from these waters. All of this was placed at risk on April 20th, 2010. An oil drilling rig exploded and sank to the ocean floor. The exposed drill pipe began leaking millions of gallons of oil into the Gulf waters. The message to Washington: this spill threatens an entire ecosystem and economy.
By all accounts, this is the perfect environmental storm.
We're seeing cancellations in abundance. A major event like this in the Gulf of Mexico is going to have long-term effects on our fisheries. All reservations have just stopped completely.
Price of your shrimp cocktail is about to go up, and the cost of getting to the restaurant to eat it is going to go up too.
Within weeks, the oil showed itself on land, arriving at a peak time when birds were nesting and fish were spawning. Like a sea monster, it rolled in without warning, leaving a toxic mess behind. For many residents, these scenes made it all too real. We travel to the Alabama coast to see some of the places at risk and meet people whose lives could be changed. Jeff DeQuattro of the Nature Conservancy meets us in Bayou La Batterie, Alabama, and we head out to an oyster restoration project that he's been working on for a year.
So this is going to attract oysters? How does this work?
Oyster larvae are naturally attracted to oyster shell.
Let me see how heavy this is. Oh man.
Yeah, 150,000 of these things are going into the water. So the idea is the larvae will naturally attach themselves here. We have huge oyster beds all in the bay out here. It's starting spawning season now. The waters are warmer. So hopefully we'll get some settlement on these oysters.
As we walk along these artificial reefs, DeQuattro explains how all these different bags, balls, and triangles full of oyster shells will eventually be covered with living oysters. Why so much work for something we eat on the half shell?
The ecosystem services that they provide are enormous and larger on scale than almost any marine habitat that there is. Oyster habitat is the most imperiled marine habitat in the world.
85% of oyster reefs have declined worldwide. UGA researcher Jeb Byers also has oyster projects that stretch from the Gulf to Georgia. Byers says oyster reefs are as important to our part of the world as coral reefs are to the tropics.
They provide essential fish habitat, so oyster reefs are actually more valuable not for the oyster itself, but actually for the economic benefit of the fisheries habitat they create. So all the red drum and the crab and the shrimp species that live on these oyster reefs are very valuable as well. And the oysters are providing those species that critical habitat they need to survive.
Both projects could be impacted by the oil spill. That could mean more than just the loss of oysters. Look how this reef off Skidaway Island, Georgia, hugs the marsh. It stops erosion and protects the shoreline, something desperately needed in Louisiana and in Alabama. If the oysters are smothered, it would take years to form another.
The young, the larvae that are in the water column, are attracted to the smell of the adults. And so they will come and they will glom on to an existing batch of adult oysters and literally cement themselves into the mix. And when that happens over a period of several years, you get these clumping effects, and when these clumps all come together, you get oyster reefs.
A lot of time and money has gone into these efforts to protect and rebuild oyster reefs. But the oil spill is a game changer. As we head back to the docks, DeQuattro sums up the mood of many.
People are scared, and it's something that's going to last for a long time. Like, this oil is going to come in waves over months and years. We'll see effects from it for probably a long time. Now, if it never hits us, if for some miraculous storm event comes in and blows this stuff south, someone else will have to deal with it. And that's sad too.
Others are already dealing with it. Oil-covered birds and turtles are bad enough, but marshes are getting hit, and that's the birthplace of much of our seafood. The eggs and larvae start here. And how do you clean up a marsh? Again, the answer is no one knows. Like Georgia, the Gulf Coast is home to many of these wetlands and refuges. Grand Bay National Wildlife Refuge is one of the most diverse and complex environments in the South. Judy Hayner with the Nature Conservancy says it is mind-boggling to think all of this could be lost.
Because everything is related to the other thing. You know, it's all interrelated. So the crabs are helping eat the snails, and the birds actually eat the snails, and the birds eat the crabs. And, you know, in here normally when the tide is up, we see little fish swimming through this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and this is where the rails, you know, come in and they'll feed. And you can see even here, some of these, see how dense those, you know, and there's a little crab, see right there? Oops, he just went in this hole.
Crabs, snails, and millions of tiny microbes. If oil ever reaches this land, those tiniest of organisms may actually be the best protection of all. Some of the microbes down in this muck have the ability to break down petroleum.
If, for example, and this is you know, completely on the table as an option, you know, if we have a certain volume, you know, if half of the marsh is really affected by pretty thick oil, could we go in and effectively burn that marsh? Marshes burn naturally. If we burn that marsh and we remove that oil, would we then provide impetus for those microbes to take off again? And if we could do that, then that would be great. We've never studied something like that. So is that a tool in our toolbox? Absolutely. Do we know anything about it at this point? No.
We come across the nest of a common marsh bird, the clapper rail. The chicks will eventually be feeding in Gulf waters, waters now contaminated with chemicals and oil. But birds don't stay in one place or feed on just one coast. Throughout the South, birds gorge themselves on tiny critters like fiddler crabs. This is how they charge up, how they get enough energy to nest or migrate. We join biologists in Georgia on Ossabaw Island as they study whimbrels, a shorebird. They are a good example of how far migratory birds can travel. We place transmitters on the whimbrels, and those transmitter signals show that these birds fly thousands of miles non-stop to the Arctic, where they nest, then thousands of miles south for the winter, before they end up back here in the spring. We're just beginning to understand how far many of these migratory birds travel and how necessary all coastal wetlands are for their survival. That's why Georgia biologists like Brad Wynn are extremely concerned about oil in the Gulf.
We know of some very, very distinct connections. American oyster catchers, all the way from Massachusetts to the Carolinas and Georgia. Some portion, usually younger birds, go to the Gulf and spend the winter in the Cedar Key area on the Gulf in Florida. And the abundance of oysters there, the availability of oysters there, support thousands, 3,000 or 4,000, which is a large chunk of the East Coast population of American oyster catchers. So when you say that oil spill is not in our backyard because it's not on our coast, it really is with migratory birds. They're connecting the Gulf with the Atlantic side. So what's happening in the Gulf could have consequences to the wildlife that spends most of the year on the Atlantic, or nests on the Atlantic seashore.
That's what makes our next visit to Grand Isle, Louisiana, so unsettling. We watch oil come in like a psychedelic rainbow, streams of orange, red, yellow. Sometimes it's so thick it looks like leather. As it pulsates in the Gulf waters, we see tiny white fish trailing on the end. As oil hits the beach, workers rake it up. But as you can see, with more oil on the way, it is a continuous process. On one tiny island, we find birds feeding, but the air smells of oil. And just a short distance away from where this bird is eating, we find that oil. Everywhere, in a multitude of colors. Hermit crabs wash to shore, only to be trapped in melting blobs. One is coated with so much crude, he struggles to move his legs, but it is a losing battle. Another has escaped from his shell, but fares no better. Gelatinous globs dot the beach, melting in the hot sun and sinking deep into the sand. It is simply pitiful. On Grand Isle, the beaches are closed. Fishing is banned, and there seems to be no end in sight. With silent protests, residents make their disgust known. Like Louisiana, most Alabama fisheries are closed. Boats sit quietly in Bayou La Batterie. This is a fishing town, but locals sense that this may be the end of a long tradition.
What will it do to this community if indeed the oil spill reaches your shores, your waters?
It'd ruin it. It'd ruin everything. It'd mess up everything. That's just like the tourists. It messes up the tourists, everything. Just like Gulf Shores and all them. I guess you've seen what all them tourists called in and canceled out.
If it comes in tar balls or whatever and gets on the bottoms, you know, in the deeper water, I'm sure they'll keep it closed for shrimping until that's cleaned up or cleared up or whatever, because if you pull your shrimp nets in and there's a big tar ball in there, it's going to contaminate the shrimp and the fish that are in there.
We stop at an office set up for fishermen who hope to get work cleaning up the oil spill. But many, like Urban Pool, fear their fishing days may be over.
If the oil moves in, life's over as we know it. It's over. It'll take 20 years. I'm too old to regroup from that. It'll never be the same around here again.
Even when you can't see the crude, everyone knows it's out there, ready to crash onto shore with the first tropical storm. As we drive through Dauphin Island, Alabama, the scene is surreal. Sections of the beach are blocked off as contractors and volunteers from across the nation prepare for the worst. When people find tar balls and oil residue on the beach, it sets off a massive cleanup effort. The irony of workers in protective gear picking up debris next to people in bathing suits is both amusing and sad. Jim McClure has been coming here for years, but fears it's just a matter of time before his favorite beach is ruined.
That's some of the residue that's up here on the beach, and you know.
Have you ever seen it before?
Never. No, this is uncommon to our coastline right here. I've never seen this on this beach before, and I've been here all my life.
There are oil booms around the coast to soak up the petroleum, but that doesn't help the fish. The Gulf is known for its seafood, and people in the industry feel a sense of helplessness. Gary Skinner and his family just wait and hope.
Well, it's spooky. I mean, we own the boat too. I got 2 sons that run the boat, and that's their livelihood. And my boat furnishes about 80% of the shrimp for this shop. And if the fisheries is shut down, the boat will be tied to the dock.
Within days of talking with Skinner, the fishery is closed.
If my boat can't work, we're going to have to try to get them somewhere else. South Florida or East Coast or somewhere.
Even though we are in oyster country, we could only find one processing plant with open doors. R&A Oysters used to operate in New Orleans, but Hurricane Katrina wiped it out. And now this. Owner Rodney Fox says he'll take a hurricane over an oil spill any day.
Katrina, hurricane came, we were shut down. After everything cleared, we opened back up. With this, we have no idea of knowing how long we'll be out. We could be out 5 years, we could be out 10 years.
Seafood companies that buy from oyster plants like R&A also face uncertainty. Will there be oysters or not?
But I think it's going to completely change the landscape of the oyster industry in Louisiana, because we're in a situation where if you allow the oil to come in, the oil is going to get set on top and kill the oysters, and it'll ruin the reefs. It just doesn't kill the crop and the young crop. It will kill everything, and we have no idea how long it'll take to make those reefs reproduce.
No one has the answer to that, because this underwater gusher is a first. University of Georgia oceanographer Samantha Joy collected data on a research vessel near the drill rig. The oil is an obvious concern, but she says the gas could be equally damning.
But in the Gulf of Mexico, this hasn't happened. This is unprecedented. And given the amount of oil and gas that are being injected into the system, you could generate large volumes of low oxygen or anoxic water. And if that happens, then you're basically creating an exclusion zone. So fish can't live in that water. Anything that requires oxygen can't live in that water. But organisms that require oxygen are going to be excluded from that water. Whether it's going to kill animals, I think they would probably run away from it. But it certainly creates a large area that is not habitable by organisms that need oxygen, and that's a problem.
She believes there is as much, if not more, methane gas in those plumes. And what will that do to the ocean? No one is sure. And what about all the chemicals used to break up the oil? Another unknown.
There are lots of different types of organisms that live in the ocean, and we have no idea what these dispersants are going to do, say, to the microbial population. We don't really understand what they do to primary producers like phytoplankton. We know that they can be toxic to fish larvae. So I think the impacts of the dispersants, when you start making lists of pros and cons, there are a lot of cons.
Looking out at a beautiful sunset, it is hard to get your head around all the destruction that could be taking place below the water. And some of that water could be headed this way.
Georgia is connected to the Gulf of Mexico by way of the Gulf Stream, one of the most powerful currents in the world. It's like an underwater river that begins here, wraps around Florida, and flows up the Atlantic coast. Let me show you how it works.
When this current of warm water reaches the Straits of Florida, it is 2,000 feet deep and 40 miles wide. It moves at around 5 miles an hour until it reaches the Atlantic, where it slows down. It travels past Georgia all the way to Newfoundland and then crosses the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Europe. The Gulf Stream is such a major ocean current, it even has an impact on the climate. If millions of gallons of oil enter this stream, no one is sure what kind of impact it will have on the Atlantic coast fisheries, the coral reefs of Florida, or even the weather. And many species of Georgia fish begin life in the Gulf.
The fact that the loop current, is the parent of the Gulf Stream, and so much of what compromises the ecology of our nearshore ocean is a function of the Gulf Stream shows that what's going on in the Gulf is going to affect the Atlantic seaboard directly through, either the mortality of larvae and eggs of species like tuna, particularly the highly migratory species that are known to use the Central Gulf as a spawning ground. It'll definitely have an impact there.
Monty Graham of Dauphin Island Sea Lab has spent years studying waters near the Gulf Stream. He says many people miss the importance of ocean currents in this catastrophe.
What the current does at the very top, and say in the upper few inches of the water, is going to be dictated by the wind, largely by the wind. So oil that floats on top of the ocean surface is going to go with the wind, but anything that's dispersed below that surface layer is going to go with the current. And so it's really important for us now to know where is the oil.
It's anyone's guess. For example, his samples in the Gulf just off Dauphin Island brought up this unexpected debris.
This was collected about 35 miles offshore.
And are you pretty sure that came from the oil spill?
We're quite confident that this came from, probably not just from the oil spill, but probably from the original accident itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So
the explosion probably released, the working hypothesis is that the explosion released these tanks of this sludgy material, this asphalt, this high asphalt crude that was being processed, probably released a certain amount of this into the sea. How it got the bubble formation in this, we're not entirely
Yeah, that's
sure
really
about.
odd looking.
Yeah.
And it is full of oil, so.
Oh yeah. You can sit here, and even with it warming up, you can see it starting to ooze. You can see it starting to ooze oils out of it. So we keep it frozen. Wow.
Our nation's playground has been turned into what sometimes feels like a military zone. Our seafood capital is all but shut down, leaving many people to ask, what will the oil do next?
I guess the question too is, how long does the oil stick around? Because the weather could be nice now, but let's say a month from now, is that a bigger concern?
It's a huge unknown. It's the X factor. We don't know. We have no idea. We can only respond to what happens.
In terms of Georgia, worst case scenario is that when the oil comes around the south of Florida, that there's a lot of mixing and turbulence in the water, potentially some hurricanes and storm events and wind events that are causing eddies and bits of the Gulf Stream to break off and form eddies into our coastline, and that would, of course, bring oil near shore.
I've been alarmed all the way through this, both on a personal level and a scientific level. So I've got no problem saying that I'm alarmed. I think people should be alarmed at what's going on.
It has been said of catastrophes, there are moments when you have to just walk away and cry. But residents of the Gulf can't walk away. This disaster threatens their way of life, a way of life many Georgians enjoy as well. An anxious vigil remains on both coasts as people watch closely for signs of dark water.
No matter who you blame, it's going to do no good if oil gets in here. Blaming, cussing, fussing ain't going to do no good. It's just pretty much going to ruin our way of life. It's going to totally destroy everything.
The oil spill has far-reaching implications for wildlife, fishermen, and consumers. But it may be years before we really understand the full impact to all of our coastal states. I'm Sharon Collins. We'll see you next time.
Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible in part by a grant from the Imlay Foundation.